Night story. I arrived in Guatemala City in mid-86. I left my town, Panzos, to search for a different future for me and my family. I am the oldest of 5 siblings. My father, who we depended on, abandoned us when my youngest sister was barely 2 years old, and my mom, who was very sick at the time, had no way to support us. So, at 15 years old, I had to take charge of almost everything. It was difficult, but I always had the support of very generous people, among them my godmother, a lady who at the time was of good social standing and never hesitated to lend a hand. Thanks to her, I had a roof over my head, school, food, and work in the capital. At that time, I worked at the house of a friend of hers. I would go every afternoon after class, clean, take care of 2 children and a grandmother. As night fell, I would make dinner and finish any pending homework so I wouldn't be rushed the next day. Like that, 4 years went by in that and other houses where I was generally treated well. I sent money and food to my mom every 2 weeks and I was preparing myself. When I finished high school, I started studying nursing because my vocation for caring for others had become evident. I feel immense joy when caring for someone translates into a smile or acts of gratitude. That led to me being highly recommended and being able to combine my studies with well-paid jobs. However, I also owe to that one of the most traumatic experiences I've had in my life. I was in my 2nd year when my godmother told me that a lady with a recognized last name in the city, which I won't mention due to the delicate nature of the story, wanted to talk to me about a job that required utmost discretion and fortitude. It was to care for her only daughter, a 17-year-old girl who had a particular problem. The pay wasn't an issue as it was a wealthy and renowned family, which was also part of the dilemma because the lady didn't want people to find out about her daughter's problem. They offered me 1,400 quetzales a month back then. Imagine when the minimum wage wasn't even 500 in those years. That was a lot of money for me, so I said yes without thinking. With that, I could help a lot at home and pay for my brother's studies, who was the next one after me. Well, I met with the lady. I presented myself at the house to see the girl and for her to meet me. But when I arrived, the first thing I encountered leaving the room were 2 nuns and a priest. Well, it must be an extremely Catholic family, and since the daughter is sick, they pay for them to say a prayer in the house and give the girl a blessing, I thought. But I entered the room and I find the young lady, the patient, a beautiful girl with chestnut hair that covered her back, white skin and light eyes, who was dressed in a wedding gown, standing in front of the mirror, looking at how a pair of shoes fit her. I stood there looking at the lady, somewhat confused, but she just shook her head from side to side as if denying any conjecture I might make. "My love, look, I present to you Sarah. She will accompany you," the lady said to the girl. She only turned slightly towards us and smiled. Then she walked to the bed, sat down with her gaze fixed on the wall, put her hands on her womb and began to say things in a low voice. The mother guided me through the room so I would know where everything was. It was a spacious area decorated in white and pink, with a huge bed with white sheets, a carpet that covered almost half the room's floor, beautiful curtains, quite lit, but with a strange smell like salt. She showed me the medications the girl had to take. They were like 10 small plastic tubes of different colors that had tiny pills inside. Most were prescription medications for psychiatric patients. I recognized some names on the labels. Others, however, I had never heard of in my life. "She goes for a walk in the patio every day before 7 a.m., the lady told me. She has breakfast at the small table that's past the kitchen because she doesn't like the dining room. She listens to music the rest of the morning and then starts getting ready until she falls asleep. There is the schedule for the pills. She wakes up around 7 p.m., and that's the most difficult part because we haven't been able to control the nervous attacks. The commitment is for you to stay with her part of the afternoon and all night. You have a place to sleep there. It's necessary you are close by because it's in the early morning hours when she needs the most attention. In the morning, the lady told me, Nora, that's my godmother, told me you study so there's no problem. They have 2 sisters from the church at those hours and they accompany her, but for the rest I would like a nurse to be with her, and they have spoken very highly of you. I only ask you please for a lot of discretion. My husband is a very important man, and we have tried these months to handle this in the best way possible." I simply nodded to everything the lady told me, but something about the story didn't quite add up for me. While the girl could have a psychiatric problem that manifested in her repetitive behavior of getting dressed as a bride every afternoon, something deep down felt off to me. If they had so much money, why not take her to a hospital in another country where no one would know so she could receive better care? Besides, most of the medications were to keep her practically out of her mind, as if they didn't want her to be functional in one way or another. Also, from what I understood, this hadn't been going on for very long. Anyway, beyond the doubts, It seemed like an excellent opportunity for me, so without giving it much more thought, I started working in that house. 2 weeks passed. The same routine every day. I would find her dressed as a bride, lying on her bed. She would get up between 6 and 7 p.m., go to the bathroom, take the medications that corresponded to that time, sit for a while next to a desk she had there, eat some boiled eggs with a glass of oatmeal, hum random songs, then she would start crying lying on the bed while rubbing her womb. Like that, it would get to 11 p.m. until she fell asleep. I slept in a room that was more like the girls' walk-in closet, but it was so big they had fitted a single bed and a dressing table. In fact, it was more comfortable than the average hotel room today. I slept with the door open and a lamp on the table to be alert, as she always got up in the early morning hours like a sleepwalker, stood in front of the mirror, cried, and went back to bed. Nothing serious or that represented any crisis, as they had warned me at first. However, one early morning, I remember it had been an exhausting day of exams, I arrived exhausted to work. She behaved well as always. I went to bed early to rest, and I don't know what really happened that night, but today I qualify that as the first encounter. I was asleep, and from within I felt a suffocating atmosphere, like when hot air is blown in your face. I remember I got up drenched in sweat, and the first thing I see facing me is her, dressed in her wedding gown. She was there, sitting on my bed, staring at me fixedly. She was wearing the veil, but I could see her face stained with eyeliner that had apparently run from her tears. I almost let out a scream, but I managed to cover my mouth. I did jump, ending up sitting with my back against the wall. "Do you need to go to the bathroom?" I asked, because sometimes it was that, but she was just there looking at me and crying. Suddenly she said, "He wants you to leave." It was the first time she had spoken to me in all those days. I was between surprised and scared. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. Shut up," she said repeatedly while holding her head and shaking it from side to side desperately. "But who are you talking about? Where is he?" I asked, because sometimes it's just associations that patients make to say that something bothers them about a thing or a person. Even so, I felt the situation was going in another direction. I feared it was something beyond me that I couldn't handle. "He is going to marry me," she told me again. "Okay," I said, "but you don't have to cry, because if you cry, your makeup will get ruined and you won't look pretty in the wedding photo." I tried to follow the conversation to see if she would suddenly say things that would help me calm her down. So, I turned on the light, approached her, and removed the veil, thinking about cleaning her face because it was all stained black. It was then that I realized that wasn't makeup, it was her skin. She had several black lines on her cheeks, like tattoos or a birthmark. However, not even 5 minutes passed after she stopped crying when all the stains disappeared, and her face became completely white again. I don't know if it was my impression, but her face looked smaller than when she was crying. I told the lady all of this the next day, but she simply diverted the conversation, told me it was nothing, and changed the subject. Another night passed after that when I felt the same atmosphere in the early morning, the same suffocating heat that burned my face. This time, I didn't get up scared but rather attentive, listening to the girl talking, but her voice was as if she was consoling another person. So, I got up carefully, walked to the door, and peeked out. She was standing in front of the window with her hands in a position as if she were carrying a baby. She was rocking it, according to her. She had opened the curtains and was there looking at the glass, from where her reflection was visible due to the internal light. I thought she had a doll in her arms because in the reflection I could see small feet, but then I saw that those feet started moving up and down. That's when I got alarmed. I turned on the lights and ran to where she was, but when I had her in front of me, I saw her arms were empty. Maybe sleep and tiredness are making me see things, I thought. "Why don't you sleep? You need to rest," I told her. But she continued with her arms in the same position and her gaze fixed on them, as if she were really attentive to a baby. Suddenly she looked up and said, "Don't make noise, he doesn't like it." "Is it your baby?" I asked. "Yes, it's our son. He brought him," she answered. I tried not to give the matter more drama. "She's a person with mental problems, it's normal," I thought. "Well, lie down with your baby so he can sleep," I told her while taking her arm to guide her to the bed. But at that instant she reacted surprisingly. She turned abruptly, grabbed my wrist, twisted my hand until I knelt in pain, and with a look full of anger, she said in a voice that wasn't hers, "Touch her again and I'll put a hole in your head." Suddenly her expression changed and she started to cry. "He doesn't like you being here," she told me in a timid voice, almost trembling. By that point, I understood that this wasn't entirely a mental problem and that there was something more. But that was confirmed for me one afternoon, almost a month later, in fact. I had talked to the lady about sleeping in another room because, while they were changing her treatment, it wasn't safe for me as she had had aggressive behaviors. However, during that month she remained calm. Sometimes she even talked to me and laughed. In one of those conversations she told me that she wasn't crazy but that she had a demon inside. She told me that without the slightest expression of shock or fear, that it was the demon of a woman who used her body to see another demon. The story was strange. I thought she was with me. That type of patient likes to invent things to scare their caregivers. But that wasn't entirely false. That was an afternoon like any other in the house. Only a domestic employee and the gardener who was changing the terrace decoration, the girl and I were there. Since classes were over, I had stayed with her all day. I even managed to talk to the nuns and the priest about the situation she was now presenting, to which they confirmed they feared the thing about the demon was true because of a couple of events. First, the father, who always prayed with her at 11 a.m., said that on several occasions, when he held her hands to say a special liberation prayer, he wasn't able to look at her face. He ended up looking at her fingers, and these, from one moment to the next, became larger and thicker, like those of an older man and not those of a slender young woman. He tried to lift his head, but his neck became stiff, and a pressure settled on the back of his neck as if a hand was pushing him to the ground. One of the nuns says she saw the situation without being able to do anything, that she was there accompanying the father when suddenly she saw that the young girl had transformed into another person, much larger and more corpulent than the father, who was already a tall man. She wanted to pray out loud to rebuke what she was seeing, but the words wouldn't come out. She could only lower her head, cling to her crucifix and wait for it all to pass. By that point, I was seriously thinking about quitting. It was something I wasn't prepared for. But since the lady wasn't in the city that day, I decided to stay all that afternoon and accompany the girl so she wouldn't be alone at night. Everything started around 5 p.m. She had woken up earlier than usual. Instead of taking off her wedding dress, she stood in front of the mirror and began to put on makeup. I remember they brought her food and she, who always ate eagerly, didn't even pay attention. She went from the mirror to the bed. She talked to a bundle of sheets she had there, which I suppose was her baby, and went back to the mirror to get ready. I was just sitting there waiting to give her the medications. Suddenly she started talking to me. "Do you know what happened?" she asked. "No, I don't know what you're referring to," I responded. "They say I'm crazy with me, but I'm fine. I just have this," she told me while holding her womb. "Does it hurt?" I asked. "Sometimes," she answered, "when it moves a lot." "Are you expecting another baby?" I asked, intrigued. "No. What I have here is the demon that killed my son and now wants to kill me." When she said that, my skin crawled. I began to see her change. I saw her from the reflection in the mirror and at the same time was attentive to the hallway door, which I had left ajar in case I had to run out. Until that moment, she remained somewhat calm, with her gaze attentive to the course of the lipstick on her mouth. "And why did that demon do that to you?" I asked. "It's that he didn't want me to get married," she told me. At that moment she turned around. She looked at me fixedly through the tiny mesh of the veil and said, "But they tell me that if we kill you, they will give me back my son." Her voice and her expression had completely changed. It didn't look at all like the face of a young girl, it was someone older. She was already completely ready with her veil, dress, train, shoes. She even had a flower, I don't know where she got it, in her hands, a dried rose. At that moment, I got up carefully to leave the room without alarming her, but just as I stood up, the door slammed shut. I had no other reaction than to scream for help. But she, I don't know how she did it, almost as if she had levitated, positioned herself behind me and with her right hand covered my mouth. Her arms were enormous, nothing like the scrawny, delicate arms I knew. Besides, I felt my head sinking into her chest, which must have been about a meter wide. I felt the monstrous presence that was holding me and the heat that gushed from her pores like salty steam, the same smell I felt when I entered that room the first time. I thought I was going to die right then. I had no chance to defend myself. She was much bigger and stronger than me. I never saw her face in that state. I only remember she grabbed my hair hard and with a yank threw me, hitting me hard against the door lock so forcefully that I fell to the ground almost unconscious. That is, I felt and saw everything around me, but my body didn't respond. At some point, I don't know if several minutes later, someone opened the door and several people entered, dressed in black. I don't know if they were real or hallucinations, but I saw her jumping from one side to the other and screaming with a demonic voice. I saw all that in a state of total stupor and drowsiness, like when you're near an explosion and only the ringing in your ears remains and blurry images you don't understand. What I do remember clearly was when someone picked me up. I think it was the gardener. There I saw her. It was only seconds. She was tied to the bed while other men held her down, and the father prayed with a huge crucifix in his hand. Everything in the room was shaking. Suddenly, her belly began to grow and grow until she vomited several blood clots. One of them moved on the bed and emitted a strange squeal. It was like a small animal, a kind of rodent. I don't know, you could only see little feet and a head. It wasn't a baby, it rather had the appearance of a rat. Then I don't remember more. They took me to a hospital because the blow to my head had left a huge ball of blood. I was there for, I don't know, days or weeks because I felt gone outside of myself. I saw the people who came, and it was as if I were in the middle of a dream. I heard them far away, their faces distorted. I had a total alteration of time and space. It was a lethargy that seemed like it would never end. But one night, I don't know exactly from which calendar, I woke up suddenly from a dream. Everything was clearer in my mind. There was a woman sitting in the chair next to the gurney. I recognized her after a few seconds. It was the young woman. She was dressed in casual clothes, had a better countenance, and looked well. I remember she leaned over to wake me up, took my hand, brought it to her mouth, and kissed it. "Forgive me," she told me while crying. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. I just cried. She stayed there sitting for a while longer, and then I saw her leave through the door. I was discharged 2 days after that. I wanted to get in touch with the lady, but I never heard from her again. She had moved from that house. She did pay all my recovery expenses and left me an envelope with my severance pay, which the father gave me days later when I went to say goodbye. That's when I found out that on that day when everything happened, the girl had died, choked on her own blood. They couldn't do anything for her. I heard that, terrified, while I looked at the hand where she had kissed me that night in the hospital, thinking it had been a dream, but that I had felt it so real. That house was left abandoned. They say they tried to sell it, but the atmosphere became so gloomy that no one wanted to buy it. Besides, some of the few workers who took care of the maintenance said they heard screams and that on several occasions they saw in the hallways of the rooms a woman dressed in a wedding gown rocking a baby in her arms. But here comes the other side of the story. On several occasions, I asked the father about the reasons why that girl had ended up like that and also why precisely she dressed as a bride, but he said he wasn't allowed to talk about it. But it was by chance that one day during a shift at the hospital, I ran into the gardener from back then. He was leaving an appointment. We had a juice in the cafeteria and talked a lot. He told me what everyone was saying, that the couple had left the country, that they were selling the house and everything else. When I asked him about what had happened before that, he fell silent for several seconds and said, "Well, that's a delicate subject. It's that her parents made her lose a child. She got pregnant by a young man who was a soldier. And that, well, it was a scandal. So it's not known where they got a man who they say was a sorcerer who gave them something to put in a drink. Everything happened one day when she escaped. She was supposedly going to marry the boyfriend. In fact, she fled the house with the white dress on, and I bet, but she didn't even make it to the street when she fainted in a puddle of blood before reaching the car that had come to pick her up. By that moment she had already lost the baby. From then on, she was never the same person, and this whole situation of dressing as a bride and crying began. They say, this I can't vouch for, that the work the sorcerer did was to put a spirit on her to make her lose the pregnancy, but that the spirit, instead of leaving after the job, took possession of her. That's a delicate subject because the parents, are like being sought for that. So, imagine that could lead to jail, the gardener commented to me. I truly never knew more about them. I hope they spent their last days repentant for the suffering they caused their own daughter because, for fear of what people would say, they ended up pushing her into misfortune.